I've been asked a number of times to show my configuration, and I typically point people to GitHub. And when I do that, I manually create the files on GitHub and post them in there, so they're not always up to date. Well, today I'm going to show you how I back up my configuration automatically to GitHub, so I don't have to manually update those files, and they're always there for you to look at when I reference them in my videos. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing you're going to need to do is have a GitHub account, and those are free. All you do is come over to github.com and create yourself an account. In addition to having an account, you need to create a repository, and that's where we're going to place our backups for Home Assistant. Now, there are two types of repositories. There's a private repository and a public repository, and obviously those are self-explanatory. Private can only be seen by you if you're logged in, and public is available to everybody. If you're going to be storing all of your configuration files, including your password file or your secrets, or you have passwords within your configuration, you want to create a private repository. This is simply going to be a backup for you to use if you need to use it for whatever reason. Public allows you to share your code with others. So if you build a nice dashboard or you have a specific configuration file that you want to share with the public, well, then you would make that a public repository. Just be careful not to share your passwords and your secrets in that public repository. And I'll show you how I do that by creating a git ignore file here in just a minute. So let's go through the steps on how to create a repository under GitHub. Once you have your GitHub account set up, just come over here to the plus sign, click new repository, give it a name. I'm going to call it HA backup because I'm going to back up my Home Assistant Pi instance. You can have a description optional. And also check here and make sure that particular name is available and that it's under your GitHub account. Now, again, you can make it public or private. So I'm going to go ahead and make mine private for now, just in case I have any passwords or things that I miss when I do this video. And you can initialize it with a README, a git ignore, but we're going to create the git ignore on the server side or on the Home Assistant side. So I need to do that. And then you could choose a license. We're going to leave all that alone for now because we don't need to worry about it. And then you just click create repository. So now you have a repository, and what you need to remember is the name of the repository. This one's HA_PI_backup.git. That's the name of my repository that I'm going to reference when I start doing the backups from Home Assistant. All right, so our next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we have the terminal and SSH add-on installed. So if you go into configuration add-ons, you should have that installed, terminal and SSH. And if you don't, click on the add-on store, search for terminal and SSH, or you can use SSH in web terminal. I'm using this one right now. That works for me. The other thing you need to make sure of is if you're not set up in your profile for advanced, if you click on the icon, you got to make sure that you have advanced mode enabled, or you're not going to be able to use the terminal or SSH. So make sure you have advanced mode enabled as well. All right, so once you do have it installed and you have it set up to show on the sidebar, you can just click on terminal right here, and it opens up a terminal window within Home Assistant for you to do your work. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a git ignore file. I want to make sure that I am in the Home Assistant configuration directory. And the way you can tell that is that you have a configuration.yaml file. If I do an ls right now, I do not have a configuration.yaml file, which means I am not in my Home Assistant configuration directory. That is typically this directory right here. So I want to change to config. So cd config. Now I do an ls, and here it is. I have my configuration.yaml file. Now I know I'm in my Home Assistant directory. So we're going to create a git ignore file, and what we're using that git ignore file for is to specify which files we want to send over to GitHub, and also lock out the ones that we don't want to send over. So we're going to do a command called nano, and it starts with a period or a decimal, git ignore. So GITIGNORE, and it's blank, should be blank for you. We're going to put some stuff in that file. I'm going to copy what I have from my notepad and put it in here, and we'll talk about what it is. I've had some issues with terminal misbehaving when I right click the mouse. So you just have to get to the point where you get the paste box showing up, and then you can paste it. That'll become important in a little bit when we do some other commands as well. Okay, so anything that starts with a an exclamation point is backed up or sent over to Home Assistant or to GitHub. It is not ignored. So these things mean not ignore when it starts with an exclamation. So all of my YAML files, my git ignore file, all of these files, my bash files, and my JavaScript files will all be backed up. I am also sending over my Node-RED directory because I run Node-RED, and I want all my Node-RED flows to be backed up as well. And then I am not sending over my secrets. Now remember, this is a git ignore file, which means we're ignoring anything unless we specifically tell it not to. So secrets.yaml is being ignored, which means it's not going to send my secrets file over to my GitHub account. So if you're considering this as a backup of your complete system, make sure that you back that up as well, unless you have all your secrets written down somewhere or kept somewhere else so you can put them back if you lose that file. I do not want the SSH folder because that's where I'm keeping my public keys and private keys. My storage.storage, which has a bunch of stuff in it as well. Cloud, Google token, if you have that, Home Assistant logs, and my RSAs. I do not want any of this stuff backed up. It's going to ignore all of these things right here. And that's important to specify this file the way you want it set up. If you want a complete backup of your Home Assistant instance into GitHub, which is not really recommended, then you can get rid of all these ignores. I would just leave it like this, unless you have something specific that you want to back up over there. Now remember, this is backing up your configuration files. You still want to do a snapshot backup from within Home Assistant. Don't treat this as your full backup for your system. If your Pi crashes, your Home Assistant crashes, and you lose everything, you're still going to want to be able to restore it from a backup because that's a one-click, wipe the system, reinstall everything kind of setup. If you try to restore from GitHub, you're only going to have bits and pieces, especially if you omit all of these directories here. So it's mostly just for configuration file referencing and backing those configuration files up, not for your entire system. So keep that in mind. Okay, once this is the way you like it, do a Control X and hit Y for yes, hit enter, and it will save now a git ignore file. And if you do an ls-al, you should actually see the .git ignore file, and here it is right here. So now we've got our GitHub account, our GitHub repository, and we've got a git ignore file on the Home Assistant server. Okay, now that you've done that, next up what we're going to do is we're going to create a set of SSH keys so that you can send information or send these files directly to GitHub with the SSH key as your authentication. That way you don't have to put in usernames or passwords or anything like that. The first step is to create a .ssh directory. So we will use the command mkdir.ssh, and that makes a directory. And if we do an lsal, you'll see that. Now we have an SSH directory. Okay, so now we're going to create an SSH key that we can use to authenticate with GitHub. And we're going to use SSH keygen, the command, to do that. So we'll start typing SSH keygen. Type of an RSA key. The size is 4096. And we'll give it an email of something like this, whatever your email address is. And we'll hit enter and it'll generate the key for us. Now I want to tell it to put that in the directory I just created. So I don't want root. I want root config.ssh because that is where I just created that. And ID RSA. We're not going to put a passphrase because if you put a passphrase, this can't be automated. You'll have to go in there and do it manually every time. Now, if that's your choice, you can do that. If you choose to automate this or plan on automating this, don't use a passphrase. So we'll hit it twice for nothing. All right, so there is my key that was just created. And what I need to do is just do an ls on the SSH directory and make sure it's in there. And so now I have an ID RSA and I have an IDRSA.pub. IDRSA.pub is your public key. That's what's going to go over to GitHub. And IDRSA is going to be the private key that stays within your system. Never share your private key, ever. Your private key is just that, your private key. If you share it out to other people, then they can compromise everything you have that key tied to. Now, for the sake of this video and for security, all the stuff I'm doing here will be dismantled after I'm done with the video so that I don't have anything sitting out there that can be compromised because I forgot to blur it in the video. So just keep that in the back of your head. I am being security conscious here while I create the video. I will remove the stuff afterwards so it's not accessible. All right. So that is now created. So we have a private, or we have an SSH key to use to talk to GitHub. Okay, so now we want to initialize our Git repo. So we will type git init here. So it's initialize an empty Git repository in config.git. And now we're going to add all the files to this. So we just use git add and then a period or decimal. And now those files are added to our local repository. And now those files have been added. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to commit all those files. So we're going to do a git commit -m and whatever you want to call it. The -m is your commit. My first GitHub upload or commit, whatever. And now we're going to make this a remote repository. And that allows us to send it over to GitHub itself. Clear this out. Git remote, add origin, and then git at github.com. And the name of your repo, so mine is Mostlychris, or the name of your GitHub account, and then your repo. So what did we say that was? That's going to be ha-pi-backup.git. So let's type ha-pi-backup, ha_pi_backup.git. And then we hit the enter key, and that is now done. Now, before we can do anything else, we need to make sure we go in there and tell Home Assistant, or sorry, tell GitHub where that key is that we just set up a minute ago. So we're going to use a command called, a git command, git config core.ssh command, and then the command itself, -i root config.ssh id rsa, and then send it to dev null, the output to dev null, and then hit enter. Now it knows where the SSH key is. Before we can actually use the SSH key that we created earlier, we need to copy the key, the public key, over to GitHub so that it knows that this is a valid connection or an authenticated connection. So we need to go into we need to cat out or view our public key, so our ID rsa.pub key. We need to copy all this, and the way you can copy in this terminal window here is to hold down your shift key and just copy all of the information, and then when you let up, it should give you the little scissor thing that shows you a copy. We'll go back over to GitHub, and under settings, you'll click on settings, and it'll take you into this window here. You'll click on SSH and GPG keys. You'll create a new SSH key, give it a title, ha-pi, or whatever you want to call it. And then you can Control-V, paste that in here. And make sure it starts with SSH RSA, that you didn't accidentally copy extra stuff. And make sure it ends with the email address here. And then you can add the SSH key. Now, it looks like this is a little weird in the formatting, so we'll just see if it takes it. If not, we may have to copy it into something like Notepad and then copy it into here so it removes any kind of weird characters that get copied over. So let's just add SSH key and see what happens. All right, so it seems to think it's okay. And this is my SSH key now. So once you've done that, you've got the SSH key, you've added the files, you've committed the files. Now we're just going to push all of the stuff up into GitHub from here. So for that, we'll use a GitHub command. So git push -u origin master. So this command is going to push all the files that we have in our origin up into the master branch on GitHub. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And it's moving all of the files up into GitHub. So I want to show you this error that came up here. Some of the files are bigger than the limit size for GitHub. And let me just go over here to GitHub now and see if it took any of the files. So we can go back over to our account here and look at the different repositories. So I'm going to go into this repository here. And there are no files here. Okay, so it didn't push everything up. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our git ignore file. For some reason, our git ignore file is including a bunch of things. And if you remember back up here in the commit, when we did the commit, you can see all of these files here. We don't want all of these files in here. We want to ignore everything else. So let's check out a couple of things with our system here. First of all, let's do a directory listing. You can see we have a whole bunch of directories on here. All these blue ones are directories. So you may want to limit that, but one of the issues I had was this file right here. The database files are too big for them to be backed up to GitHub, and I don't want them there anyway. So I've gone into my git ignore file, and I have made some changes to that. I've excluded all these directories, and I've excluded the logs and the v2 directory, as well as some other logs as well. I want to make sure that I am not backing up stuff like logs and things and databases that I don't really need backed up on GitHub. I just want my configuration files. So let's do a git add again, and let's do a git commit, and we'll give it a name. Second try. Let's see what files we get with our git commit this time, and make sure that none of the big files show up in there that we don't want. And let's see if we can get a git push to work this time. And then our files get pushed up, and you can see that it's created a new branch over on the server called master. And if we go over to GitHub, we should see all the files here. So I'll just do a quick refresh here. And here are all our files that have been sent up to the GitHub site from our server. And this is specifically based on the git ignore file that we set up. Now, for some reason, SSH is showing up in here, so we just need to tweak our git ignore file to make sure that we don't include the SSH directory if we don't want. But this is a private repo, so right now it's not viewable. But you make sure that you don't put anything sensitive here that you don't want on the intranet. Okay, so now the files are up here. We want to automate this. And the way we're going to automate this is we're going to go into and create a shell command. And that's under terminal. And we're going to create this shell command. This is basically a shell file. We're going to call it push updates. .sh, so that's a nano again. And we're going to put in about 3 different lines of information here. We're going to copy that from my notepad, and I'm just going to paste it in here. And we're doing the same commands. The only difference is now that we're committing them with a timestamp or date timestamp, so you can see when the work or the commit was actually done. So everything else is the same. We're just putting it in a script so that it can be run. We're going to save that. We're going to change it to an executable file. So a plus x or plus x and push updates. So all it does is it makes the system be able to actually execute the file, right? So now what we want to do is we want to do a test run. So I'll do a test run, push updates. And you see it runs through just fine. If we come over here, we may or may not see a change to any of our files. And here it is. We do, because this is a new file, right? So this is our new file with the commit date on it that we did. So that's how we want this to work. So we know it's working directly in the shell. Now we want to automate this. But here's a hiccup to that. So they went back and changed in terminal. They removed the ability to run commands directly from standard in on the add-on from the automation. So we're going to have to add an extra step to this. We are going to have to create a shell command entry in our configuration.yaml. You can either do this through file editor or you can do it here. I'm just going to do it here directly. Since we're already in this directory and in terminal, I'll just nano, not bi, nano the configuration.yaml file. And we'll go down here to the bottom of the file, and we'll just create an entry called shell command. And you can see the shell command in Home Assistant. Here's the whole shell command setup. Basically, it's shell command. You give it an alias or name, and then the actual command you want to run. So I'll go over here to terminal, go in a couple spaces for YAML, give it a name. I'm going to just call it push updates. To GitHub. That's my alias. And I'm going to give it the command. And the command I want to run is /. Now this is relative to your configuration directory, I believe. Let me think for a second. Let me go back. You want to actually run it from the directory you're in. So I want to run it from config, because it starts off in the root directory. And then you have to go to config. So I want to run config. Push updates. Actually, I don't want to do that. Let me tell you why. You need to be in the directory that you're running this from so that it can look at the GitHub or Git directory and get all the information, including the git ignore file. So I need to do push updates. That is the actual script that we're going to run. So if we look at our shell command here, I just want to double check that. So I'm going to actually start with /bin/bash. So we go back over here to terminal, and I'm going to do it /bin/bash push updates.sh, and we'll save this file. Now you have to restart Home Assistant for it to pick up this file. But before I do that, I want to make one more change to my push updates file. And let's go here. I want to do a cd/config. That way, if it starts in the root directory, it'll change to this directory that we're in now and run all of this, because otherwise it's going to try to run it from the root directory and it won't have any of the information it needs to function. It's going to be outside of the environment. All right, so we're going to save that and do that. All right, and now what I need to do is restart Home Assistant. So I'll go back out of here and I'll restart Home Assistant. But first, always check your configuration and make sure that you don't have an issue with your configuration. So it's valid, so I'm going to restart it. Yep. And we'll come back here in a second once it's restarted. So it's restarting and it's back up and running now. So we should have under our developer tools, we should have the ability to run a service called, let me get rid of that, push updates. So here's our shell command, push updates to GitHub. We should be able to call this service and it should do an update to GitHub for us. If everything goes well. Does everything always go well the first time? Maybe, maybe not. So let's check it out. Let me go over to my GitHub account and see if anything worked. And I don't see that it did it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into my log files. And I'm going to look at the logs and see if it gives me an error. All right, so we're getting a return code 128. So we're having an issue with this not running correctly. The way to solve that is to go in and let's first talk about it. You have normally when you go through and you run something, it prompts you for that known host entry, which we talked about earlier on. But whenever you run this through HA, the known host file is stored in a different location. So you have to tell it where that is. And every time you do this, it wipes it clean. So there is a simple solution that we're going to do now that allows us to set the known host in the right place and allows GitHub to read it or Git to read it whenever it tries to connect to GitHub. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into terminal and we're going to run one more command that's going to tell it to do what we want it to do. So let me go into config and let's copy it from there. And I'm going to paste it in here, hopefully. So this is the command. It is git config core SSH command, user known host file, and strict host checking keys no. And then it says, here's where this stuff is for the key. And we'll just hit enter. Now, crossing fingers as everything goes well, we'll go back in here, we'll run the automation, get out of this, or we'll run the developer tools. We'll push this or call this service. And hopefully everything goes the way it's supposed to. We should see an update in here. And we do, we see the update. So now we know this is working from the shell command. So now all we have to do to automate this is we go into automations. We create a new automation. It'll be a blank one. We'll say GitHub push. And the trigger will be, we'll just say time. We'll pick a time. Doesn't matter what it is, whatever you want it to be. Let's say 2 a.m. Fine. And then the action is going to be call service. And the service is going to be push, shell command, push updates to GitHub. Save it. And we could run the actions again if we wanted to test it. But now we have in our automations a GitHub push that will run and push that at 2 a.m. every day up to GitHub. So that is it. We've done the whole thing. It seems like it took a long time to get here, but everything is working now. So you're basically taking all those files that you want to back up to GitHub. and getting it all set up, and then going and doing an automation to send them up. Now, if you do some changes and you want to get those right up to GitHub, you can always come in here and just run the actions and push them up, or you can go in the terminal and execute that script and have them push it up, or do all the manual commands as well. Let me know if you have any questions. Some gotchas are to make sure you have your git ignore file set up the way you want it, so you don't get a bunch of extra files you don't need. And make sure you have your SSH keys set up, and that you have that last command I ran if you want to run this from an automation. And remember, you can't use auto standard in or add-on standard in anymore for this. That's been removed from the SSH terminal, but you can run a shell command and run it that way through automation. All right. Thank you for watching this video. If you're not a subscriber, I'd love for you to subscribe. Hit that thumbs up if you liked the video, and we will see you on the next one.